Chapter 911. On the side of the stand, Long Jingguo sat there, with Long Xingxiu beside him, but both of them were wrapped tightly so that no one would recognize them. Patriarch, if you want to know if this David is the son of the eldest miss, you can try this guy's blood first. If the blood in his body senses your breath and reacts, it will prove that you two were individuals are connected by blood. Long Xingxiu said in a low voice. Long Jingguo didn't speak, but with a flick of his finger, an inaudible breath went straight to David. David, who was preparing to draw lots, suddenly trembled slightly, and then looked at the place where Long Jingguo was sitting. David didn't know Long Jingguo, and he had never seen Long Jingguo, but when his eyes fell on the tightly wrapped Long Jingguo, David's heart twitched. Although he couldn't see the other person's appearance, David could feel who was sitting here. The full of anger burned in David's heart. Just when David couldn't control his emotions, suddenly Andrew patted David on the shoulder. "Little man, it's your turn." Andrew's sudden interruption made David's anger dissipate in an instant. David knew that it was not the time for him to fight with the Long family, and his strength was simply no match for the Long family. If it is too early to let the Long family know his exact identity, then David's troubles will be even greater in the future. David turned around and started drawing lots. And after a gleam of light flashed in Long Jingguo's eyes, he slowly got up, turned around and left without stopping or watching the next game. Seeing this, Long Xingxiu also hurriedly followed. At this moment, all parties in the arena have already drawn lots, and then it is time to enter the official battle. I saw a short and dark man jumping suddenly, and then his body fell directly and steadily on the ring. At the same time that the short man fell on the ring, there was another man with a turban and a beard on his head. Step up to the stage without any hassle. The two of them clasped their fists face to face and didn't speak, but the aura emanating from the two instantly collided. The short man's body suddenly bounced up, punching the man with the turban on his head. This punch was ruthless and unexpected, and the speed was extremely fast. There were bursts of harsh air explosions in the air. The power of this punch was evident. Mr. Chen, the one who punched is Songpa, a master from Taiguo. This person has practiced Muay Thai since he was a child, and his strength and speed have been extremely fast, and his shot is also very ruthless. Zhao Wuji introduced it to David. David didn't care, although the Songpa punched fiercely, and the strength and speed were superb, but for David, these were not enough. Ability also cannot break David's indestructible golden body. Just as Zhao Wuji was introducing David, Songpa had already attacked more than a dozen punches one after another. Not only his fists, but Songpa's knees also attacked the opponent like a storm. In just a few dozen seconds, the man with the scarf wrapped around his head was punched directly in the abdomen, flew out of the ring, and smashed to the ground heavily, spitting blood. Although the injury was not light, Na Songpa was obviously showing mercy and did not take the opponent's life. After winning one blow, Na Songpa looked at the audience excitedly. "The next one can play." Songpa's voice just fell, and I saw Watanabe Chiro's body trembled slightly, and then the whole person fell on the ring like a feather. Chapter 912. Seeing that the next one turned out to be Watanabe Chiro, Songpa's face obviously changed, and it seemed that Songpa was still afraid of this Watanabe Chiro. "Did you get off the stage yourself, or do you need me to do it?" Ichiro Watanabe looked at Songpa and asked with a look of disdain. Songpa frowned, although he was afraid of Ichiro Watanabe, but now in front of so many people, and on such an occasion, how could Songpa voluntarily admit defeat? "Who wins and who loses, not sure," Songpa said, and smashed Watanabe Chiro with one punch. This time Songpa's speed was a little faster, but in the first fight just now, Songpa still retained his strength. Facing Songpa's punch, Ichiro Watanabe had one hand behind his back and the other hand holding the long sword in his hand. It seemed that he had no intention of making a move. When Songpa saw Watanabe Chiro despise him so much, his inner anger rose up, and with a roar, Songpa exuded a terrible breath, and this breath instantly turned into a Buddha statue. I saw the big hand of the Buddha statue and patted Ichiro Watanabe in front of him. The seemingly fluttering palm contained an overwhelming force. The power was incredible. Looking at the scene in front of him, Andrew's expression changed slightly, while Zhao Waoqi looked back at David, wanting to see David's reaction, but found that David's face was calm, as if there was no change in his expression. This is the Daluo Vajra palm. I didn't expect this Taiguo guy in front of him to actually learn the Daluo Vajra palm. The power of this palm is probably stronger than a bomb. I wonder if Ichiro Watanabe can take it. Ichiro Watanabe is not scared, why is he still motionless? On the stand, everyone was talking. Songpa let out bursts of roars, and the Daluo Vajra palm was like the top of a mountain. Seeing that palm was about to hit Ichiro Watanabe's head, Ichiro Watanabe still stood motionless. Just when everyone couldn't figure out what Watanabe Ichiro was going to do, suddenly Watanabe Ichiro took the sword with his right hand, while his left hand was still behind him. Many people didn't see clearly what Ichiro Watanabe was sitting on, but the expressions of some powerful people in the stands changed slightly at this moment, and David also changed his expressions. Because he could see that this Watanabe Ichiro didn't do nothing, but just suddenly moved, and he had already drawn his sword and stabbed more than a dozen swords. It's just because the speed is so fast that many people can't see Watanabe Ichiro's movements clearly. The Buddha statue condensed in front of Ichiro Watanabe began to dissipate, and Songpa looked at Ichiro Watanabe with shock in his eyes. The two were only half a meter apart, but no one moved at this time. A gust of breeze blew, and Songpa's body suddenly fell on the ring. With Songpa's body falling to the ground, bursts of blood shot out from Songpa's body, like bloody arrows shooting in all directions, making the ring bloody. There are at least a dozen blood holes on Songpa's body, and the whole person will be stabbed into a hornet's nest. Songpa's eyes widened, and he couldn't rest his eyes. I can't blame me for not cherishing this opportunity for you to step down from the stage. Looking at Songpa's body, Ichiro Watanabe said proudly. Everyone watched this scene in shock. Ichiro Watanabe's strength was beyond the imagination of many people. Andrew, who was full of confidence at the beginning, turned extremely solemn at this moment. Zhao Waoqi turned his head and looked at David with worry in his eyes. The strength shown by Ichiro Watanabe is really terrible. If David was not an opponent, he would definitely be killed on the spot. Chapter 913. Mr. Chen. Zhao Waoqi wanted to confirm with David whether David was sure of defeating Ichiro Watanabe. David did not speak, but gave Zhao Waoqi a calm look. Zhao Waoqi didn't say anything, he turned his head back again and looked at the top of the ring. At this time, the top of the arena has been cleaned up, and Taiguo's team glared at Ichiro Watanabe, but they dared not to speak out, not to mention that they had already signed the life and death status in advance, and there was no revenge for this kind of thing. Who is the next? Ichiro Watanabe held the long sword in his arms, looked around, and said proudly. The representative of the Arrow Kingdom under the stage looked extremely ugly. According to the rules of the lottery, he should have come to power, but the strength shown by Ichiro Watanabe just now made the representative of the Arrow Kingdom a little timid. In the end, the representatives of Arrow Kingdom simply conceded defeat. They knew that when they came to power, they could only be beheaded. After the representative of Arrow Country conceded defeat, the next one was Andrew of Bear Country. Andrew, are you sure? Princess Anna asked Andrew. This time, Andrew did not have the confidence he had just now. He frowned slightly and said, I'll try it. Anna didn't say anything, but quietly handed Andrew a pill. Andrew glanced at Anna, put the pills in his pocket, and walked slowly to the ring. Anna clenched her fists, obviously a little nervous. Princess Anna, your Andrew warrior is not necessarily the opponent of Ichiro Watanabe, you don't have to be nervous. Seeing Anna who was nervous, Zhao Waoqi comforted her in a wide voice. Zhao Pavilion Master, thank you, we Bear Country warriors are not allowed to fail. Anna's eyes were firm. Even if you give him a burst pill, you guys with strong limbs and simple minds are not the opponents of Ichiro Watanabe. David said lightly. What did you say? Anna looked at David angrily. If we Andrew warriors can't beat that Watanabe Ichiro, then you won't be an opponent. You'd better pray that our Andrew warriors can win this match. In this case, you can still save a life. No need to pray, there is no suspense in this match. David shook his head slightly. Anna glared at David and didn't speak. At this moment, Andrew and Ichiro Watanabe were already fighting together on the ring. When facing Andrew, Watanabe Ichiro obviously did not have the ease when facing Songpa, and the long sword in his hand was drawn. The willow-like long sword exudes a cold light, as thin as a cicada's wings, and every sword swing is like a bolt of lightning. Relying on the advantage of his body size, Andrew has a pair of iron fists, and he is not afraid of the long sword in Watanabe Ichiro's hand, and directly uses a pair of iron fists to follow Watanabe Ichiro's long sword. Clang clang! With the sound of Jinji, Andrew's fists were uninjured. Although the two sides came and went with me, no one took advantage, but Andrew used his fists to fight against Ichiro Watanabe's long sword. It was obvious that Andrew was superior. Do you see it? The iron fists of our Andrew warriors are not afraid of any sharp weapons. I have seen with my own eyes that the Andrew warriors grabbed the shot bullets with their hands. Seeing that Andrew seemed to be gradually gaining the upper hand, Anna instantly became less nervous, looking at David and said proudly. David just smiled and said lightly, within 10 moves, your Andrew warrior will definitely lose. What did you say? Anna stood up with a rub. Are you cursing our warriors? Chapter 914. Princess Anna, calm down. Seeing this, Zhao Waoqi hurriedly persuaded Anna. Then he looked at David and said, Mr. Chen, Xiongguo is a friendly neighbor of our country, you can bear with it, but don't offend this Princess Anna and damage the diplomatic relations between the two countries. David nodded, got it. Just as David and the others were talking, Andrew and Ichiro Watanabe on stage had already fought 5 or 6 moves again. Your pair of iron fists are really powerful, but that's all there is to it. Watanabe Ichiro looked at Andrew with a sneer, and suddenly his figure flashed. Andrew burst out with momentum, and the muscles on his body suddenly swelled, like a layer of armor tightly wrapping his body. Ichiro Watanabe is going to use the 9 Shadows sword technique. Seeing this, Zhao Waoqi hurriedly said in shock. That Anna's face also obviously became tense again. Pavilion Zhao, what is this 9 Shadows sword technique? David asked. Mr. Chen doesn't know, this Ichiro Watanabe's most powerful swordsmanship is the 9 Shadows swordsmanship. The 9 Shadows swordsmanship is performed to the extreme, and the opponent seems to be fighting against 9 identical people, each of which is a phantom. And each one seems to be real. That is the kind of swordsmanship that Watanabe Ichiro used to defeat our 5 major martial arts by himself. Zhao Waoqi explained. So powerful. David frowned slightly and didn't say anything, but stared at Ichiro Watanabe's every move on stage. I saw Watanabe Ichiro's figure flashing, as if it suddenly split, and suddenly another Watanabe Ichiro appeared, and then split again. 3 identical Watanabe Ichiro surrounded Andrew. 2 of these 3 must be phantoms, but in the eyes of everyone, each one is so real. Andrew, to deal with you, I only need 2 shadow clones. Ichiro Watanabe said with disdain. The sound seemed to come from the mouths of the 3 Watanabe Ichiro, and it was impossible to distinguish them from the sound alone. Andrew's face was dignified and terrifying at the moment, and without hesitation, he took out the medicine pill that Anna gave from his pocket and threw it directly into his mouth. Roar! After the elixir was entered, Andrew's huge body let out a roar, and then the muscles on his body began to swell and crack. Soon, Andrew's body turned into a big brown bear covered with brown fur, with scarlet eyes showing fangs. Bearman! Zhao Waoqi looked at Anna in surprise. Anna didn't speak, but stared nervously at the ring. David was very surprised when he saw that Andrew turned into a brown bear. He didn't know what a bear man was, and it was the first time he saw it. He didn't expect these things to exist abroad. Dare to transform in front of everyone's eyes, it seems that you also know that you are bound to lose. Ichiro Watanabe didn't seem to have the slightest surprise that Andrew suddenly turned into a brown bear. On the contrary, there was a hint of excitement on his face. Roar! Andrew roared, and the huge bear paw slapped Ichiro Watanabe. Facing Andrew's attack, Ichiro Watanabe did not move, with a faint sneer on his face. Boom! Andrew slapped it with a palm, and the entire ring shook for a while, but Ichiro Watanabe in front of him was unscathed. In this palm just now, Ichiro Watanabe's phantom was only captured, so it was impossible to hurt Ichiro Watanabe. Andrew missed a hit and quickly turned around and slapped Ichiro Watanabe on the other side again. Unfortunately, this time it was empty again. Andrew was furious, and his palms kept attacking Watanabe Ichiro around him, but he failed to hit every time. No matter which direction he attacked, Watanabe Ichiro turned out to be a phantom. Soon, Andrew gasped heavily, consuming a lot of energy, the brown hair on his body slowly faded, and his eyes returned to their original color. Chapter 915. Andrew returned to his original appearance, and the breath on Andrew's body was not enough to support him to continue transforming. Looking at Andrew like that, the three Watanabe Ichiro instantly joined together and stood in front of Andrew in an instant. The long sword in his hand was placed directly on Andrew's neck, and now as long as Ichiro Watanabe waved gently, Andrew would be separated. However, Ichiro Watanabe did not kill Andrew, but with a wave of the long sword in his hand, Andrew's body was instantly scratched with scars. Soon, a large turtle pattern was drawn on Andrew's chest. Although Ichiro Watanabe did not kill Andrew, this practice was even more humiliating. "I kill you!" Andrew looked at the blood dripping from his chest and roared at Ichiro Watanabe. But Ichiro Watanabe kicked off the ring. "If it wasn't for the fact that you are from the Xiong country, I would have killed you long ago." Watanabe Ichiro sneered. Andrew seemed to have lost his mind at the moment, desperately trying to rush towards the ring. Such humiliation is more uncomfortable than killing him. "Andrew!" Anna shouted, since she lost, she lost. If the entanglement continued, Xiong Qiahui would be even more embarrassed. Hearing Anna's cry, Andrew walked back as a last resort. The wound on his chest was still bleeding, but Andrew didn't care. "Now it's your turn, Daxia Kingdom, I hope this competition won't disappoint me." Ichiro Watanabe looked at Zhao Waoqi and said with a look of arrogance and contempt. Zhao Waoqi was full of anger, and then looked back at David. He wanted to tell David a few words, but he didn't want David's foot to be lightly stunned, and the whole person flew to the top of the ring. Ichiro Watanabe looked at David, who came to power, and the disdain in his eyes became more intense. "You even sent a great master to compare with me, don't you think that there is no one in the Big Xia country? Kill you, my strength is enough." David spoke lightly, his tone full of confidence. "Ha ha ha, arrogant, I like to see you arrogant, because the more arrogant you are, the more bloodthirsty you can arouse." Watanabe Ichiro squinted his eyes, his pupils shone brightly, then inserted the long sword in his hand into the ring, and slowly stretched out a palm. It seems that Ichiro Watanabe intends to defeat David with his bare hands. In his eyes, David's strength is not enough for him to draw his sword. "You want to beat me with your bare hands?" David's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's enough to deal with you with bare hands, yours is not qualified for me to draw my sword." Watanabe Ichiro sneered. "If you don't draw the sword, I'm afraid you will never have the chance to draw the sword again." David looked calm. "Ha ha ha, then I'm going to try it." After Watanabe Ichiro finished speaking, his eyes were cold, and he slapped David with a palm. Stab! With just this palm, the entire air seemed to be torn apart, and then a strong wind swept out. Watanabe Ichiro is not only a swordsman, he also has a deep energy. This energy instantly pierced the surrounding air, and went towards David with an incomparably sharp shriek. On the ring, a deep imprint was instantly drawn by this energy. You must know that this ring is specially made of hard granite for this competition, and it has been tempered and polished to be extremely hard. But at this time on the ring, a sharp friction sounded, and a deep imprint appeared. The strength of Watanabe Ichiro's palm is sharper than a sharp blade. Facing this powerful energy, David raised the corner of his mouth slightly, and suddenly bursts of golden light erupted all over his body, followed by David like a silkworm chrysalis wrapped in golden light. What? When Watanabe Ichiro saw David's change, his expression changed slightly. How could such a terrifying aura erupt from a person with the strength of a great master? Chapter 916. Soon the strength like a sharp blade hit David. Clang clang. There was a sound of metal colliding, and the energy hit David's body, and there were bursts of fire, and finally disappeared. Such a terrifying energy could not break David's defense and cause any damage to David. How can that be? Ichiro Watanabe was shocked. Also shocked was Anna under the stage. She originally thought that David would die when he came to power, but the scene in front of her made Anna have to re-examine David. Andrew grew his mouth even more and looked at everything in front of him in disbelief. He couldn't believe that David, a small man, was able to resist Ichiro Watanabe's attack without being injured. This is simply incredible. Instructor Chen, great job. Instructor Chen is awesome, fkook them. Beat him, Instructor Chen beat him hard. When the members of the Dharma Protector Pavilion saw this, they all shouted excitedly. What kind of cultivation technique do you have to be able to resist my blow without being hurt? Ichiro Watanabe asked David coldly. Do you still need any exercises to deal with you? Your attack is like scratching your itch. I advise you to pick up your sword. The corners of David's mouth were slightly the same, and he said with a look of disdain. Just now, Ichiro Watanabe's face was full of arrogance and disdain, but now he is looked down upon by the other party. With such a blow, Ichiro Watanabe roared. I do not believe. Ichiro Watanabe roared, and again slapped David with a savage palm. This time, his energy was even more fierce, like a tornado that instantly swept the entire ring. The terrifying energy made the air above the ring seem to be sucked away in an instant. David's body was also in the terrifying energy, slowly leaving the ring and his feet hanging in the air. David's body was getting higher and higher from the ring, and the terrifying energy tornado directly wrapped David. Those blade-like energy began to attack David's body continuously. The sound of metal collisions resounded in my ears, and all eyes were fixed on David, but at this time David's figure had begun to become blurred. At this moment, in the tornado of energy, there was a flash of red light, followed by a flash of light, just like a round of light suddenly emitted by the sun. Cut! David held the dragon-slaying sword in his hand, and slashed it hard in front of him. Click! With a crisp sound, in everyone's unbelievable eyes, the surging energy tornado was directly cut into two pieces by David. Immediately after the energy tornado was ours, David's body also slowly fell to the ground. On the ground, the dragon-slaying sword in David's hand was burning with a raging flame, and the red blood flowing on the sword kept making the flame burn even more fiercely. Man and sword unite. Seeing this, Ichiro Watanabe widened his eyes, his face full of disbelief. Now, am I qualified to let you draw your sword? David said, with a flick of his figure. He was already in front of Ichiro Watanabe with the dragon-slaying sword in his hand. It rang loudly. Facing David's sword, Ichiro Watanabe no longer had the arrogance and contempt he had at the beginning. He directly reached out and grabbed the hilt of his sword, and slammed it hard. Click! Ichiro Watanabe's sword was like a shooting star, and it was unsheathed in an instant. Clang! With a deafening sound, the two swords collided fiercely. At the moment when the swords touched, David and Watanabe Ichiro stepped back at the same time, opening the distance. The touch this time made them understand each other's strength, and both their wrists were aching. Chapter 917. Watanabe Ichiro's face was solemn, and he held the hilt of the sword with both hands. The moment he held the sword, the momentum on his body began to change. It turns out that you are not in the realm of a great master. You know how to hide your strength at a young age, and your scheming is so deep, I can't keep you today after seeing it. After Ichiro Watanabe finished speaking, he held his sword in both hands, and he slashed towards David with his sword. The sharp sword energy was mixed with the sound of breaking the air, and David hurriedly raised the dragon-slaying sword to resist. Clang! With another crisp sound, Ichiro Watanabe's sword was blocked. When the strike missed, Ichiro Watanabe's sword light turned, and the man walked with the sword, turning into a sword light, swept away towards David. In just a few seconds, Ichiro Watanabe has swung more than a dozen swords towards David, and one after another fierce sword energy enveloped David's body. The dragon-slaying sword in David's hand was constantly waving, resisting Ichiro Watanabe's attack, and the sound of metal collision continued to sound. Seeing that David only had the power to parry, Ichiro Watanabe's mouth curved into a corner. Break! Suddenly David shouted, and then the flame on the dragon-slaying sword burst into flames, and the entire void trembled. After destroying Ichiro Watanabe's sword chi, David slashed at Ichiro Watanabe with one sword, and the spiritual power in his danshin gathered crazily on the body of the sword, and the scorching flames made half of the sky red. Seeing this, Ichiro Watanabe hurriedly raised the sword in his hand to resist, but only heard a sound like Hong Zhong de Lu. Ichiro Watanabe could only feel the power of Mount Tarzan pouring into his body crazily, while Ichiro Watanabe's feet sank deeply into the ring. In the hard granite ring, Ichiro Watanabe's feet were fully half a meter deep. Ichiro Watanabe's eyes were full of shock. He didn't expect David's power to be so great. The power contained in David's sword just now was afraid that it could destroy a hill. If it weren't for Ichiro Watanabe's high level, if he were a General Wuzong, this sword would have split the person in half long ago. Boy, you are really amazing, you can force me to perform stunts at a young age. After Watanabe Ichiro finished speaking, his body trembled slightly. Immediately afterwards, Ichiro Watanabe's body began to split, 1, 2, 3. In the end, 4 identical Watanabe Ichiro held swords and surrounded David. Is there only 4? Isn't this the 9 Shadows sword technique? Just imagine it together, save the trouble. David said lightly to the 4 identical Watanabe Ichiro. Humph, how easy it is to cultivate the 9 shadow clones. I have practiced for decades, and I have just reached the 4th shadow, but even so, beheading you is enough. Ichiro Watanabe snorted coldly. The voices came from all directions, as if they were spoken from the mouths of 4 Watanabe Ichiro at the same time. David couldn't tell which Watanabe Ichiro was the body at all. Since you are so confident, then try my clone too. After David finished speaking, the dragon-slaying sword in his hand suddenly disappeared, and in David's palm, 2 faint blue flames began to jump. David flicked his fingers, and blue flames fell around and began to burn. The flames surrounded David and Ichiro Watanabe, and the center of the entire flame was shining with dazzling light. Because of the intense light, everyone in the audience could not see the situation in the center of the flame. Watanabe Ichiro frowned slightly, and then stabbed David with his sword. 4 identical Watanabe Ichiro stabbed David, and all 4 directions were blocked. David is now unavoidable. Now you can only choose to block in one direction, but if you choose the wrong one, you will be completely defeated. Chapter 918. However, in the face of Ichiro Watanabe's attack, David did not choose to fight back. These light curtains are like mirrors, directly reflecting the figures of David and Watanabe Ichiro. Under the constant reflection of the light curtains, David's figures suddenly increased by dozens. All around this formation were David's figures. Ichiro Watanabe was stunned. He couldn't tell which of these figures was the real David. How about it, my avatar is not bad, right? David sneered. He thought of this method when he watched Ichiro Watanabe use the 9 Shadows sword technique to deal with Andrew. What? Ichiro Watanabe suddenly roared, and then the sword in his hand slashed towards the surrounding formations. With the sword cut, the light curtain disappeared instantly, but with the departure of the sword in Ichiro Watanabe's hand, the light curtain would appear again. These light curtains are all supported by the light blue flames. If you want to destroy the light curtains, you can only extinguish the light blue flames. It's just that Ichiro Watanabe shot a few bursts of energy to hit the blue flame, but the flame didn't go out at all, not even shaking. Now we can compete fairly. You want to use your tricks, but it's useless. David looked at Ichiro Watanabe with a cold face and said. Watanabe Ichiro looked at David gloomily, and several clones disappeared instantly. Do you think this can restrain my 9 Shadows swordsmanship? Still behind? Watanabe Ichiro said. The cicada wing sword in his hand was raised high, followed by a long whistle. The green light in his eyes skyrocketed, the fighting spirit rose, and the breath of his body was mixed with bloody aura. The first sword of the 9 Shadows sword technique, the sword chi is like a rainbow. Watanabe Ichiro's monstrous energy condensed on the sword body, and then the sword was thrown high, flipped in the void, the blue light shone, and the sword energy instantly enveloped David's head. Watanabe Ichiro's face was sinking like water, his inner strength had been raised to the extreme, the sword in midair was directly controlled by Watanabe Ichiro's strength. Seeing this, David clenched his right fist, golden light flashed above his fist, and then suddenly smashed his fist into the air. Bang! David's fist strength collided with the sword chi, and the entire arena began to tremble, and a huge shock wave, like a gust of wind, swept toward the surroundings. Ichiro Watanabe's sword swayed in mid-air, and then fell down. Seeing this, Ichiro Watanabe opened his hands like bird wings, leaped into the air, and grasped the falling sword. The second sword of the 9 Shadows sword technique, the sword follows your heart. The blue light on the sword body kept flickering. Ichiro Watanabe held a long sword. In mid-air, the sword merged into one, turning his entire body into a sharp sword and stabbing directly at David's heart. David's aura exploded violently in an instant, followed by David's backhand pressing, directly pressing Watanabe Ichiro's sword with his hand, and then a huge spiritual force swarmed out from David's body, and followed the sword in Ichiro Watanabe's hand struck hard on Ichiro Watanabe's chest. Ichiro Watanabe fell to the ground and took 2 steps back. But this time, Ichiro Watanabe was even more angered, and after that, Ichiro Watanabe's third sword followed. David raised his palm as a knife, and a golden light in the sky seemed to cut through the whole world. The golden light of the sword made Ichiro Watanabe's face change greatly, and immediately after he let out a loud shout, a bright white light shot out in his eyes, the sword in his hand was raised above his head, and all the energy in his body was condensed together. Chapter 919. Break out the water. The sword in Ichiro Watanabe's hand rose into the sky, almost reaching a height of tens of meters. The sword energy in his hand swooped down into the sky, and then collided with David's palm knife. The void trembled, and the entire arena was crumbling, as if it could not bear such power at all. David jumped up at the moment when the golden blade and the white sword collided, and as David jumped high, the formation formed by the light blue flames all around was extinguished, and the formation disappeared. Rumbling. The arena was severely cut into a ravine by Ichiro Watanabe's sword energy, and then the arena couldn't bear it and collapsed from the middle. Ichiro Watanabe's body only felt like it was falling down, and then he took a deep breath, like plucking green onions from dry land, without any external force, his body jumped straight up. When David saw this, murderous intent flashed in his eyes. This was the opportunity he needed. Just when Ichiro Watanabe's body rose from the ground, David's body was already in the air, and then he punched out. Boom! A punch actually smashed through the void in an instant, the huge vibration wave spread everywhere, and the sound of breaking the sky rang out. This punch condensed all of David's strength, without any reservations. Ichiro Watanabe felt the sharp sound of breaking the sky above his head, and his face changed greatly. He did not expect that David had just jumped up, not to avoid his own blow, but to have planned it for a long time, wait. To deal a fatal blow to him. Feeling that he was careless, Ichiro Watanabe suddenly stopped moving upwards, and then used a heavy weight to make his originally raised body begin to descend rapidly. However, Ichiro Watanabe's reaction was still slow, and David's punch was already in front of him. Ichiro Watanabe was helpless and could only throw a punch with difficulty. The sword in his hand had already become a decoration. In this rush, he couldn't use the sword in his hand. Bang! The fists faced each other, and there was another deafening sound. The spiritual power of David's punch directly penetrated Watanabe Ichiro's defense, and thumped it hard on the chest. Ichiro Watanabe was in the air, a mouthful of blood spurted out, his chest dented instantly, and he slammed heavily on the ground. David's body fell to the ground, but his figure still swayed a few times. He just followed Ichiro Watanabe's battle, which made David's consumption huge. Win the king or lose the bandit, today you lost in my hands, this is your home. After David finished speaking, he suddenly took a breath and clenched his right fist. Immediately afterwards, the spiritual power in his danshin continued to condense on the right fist. He prepared to use his last strength to kill Ichiro Watanabe. Seeing that David was about to kill himself, Ichiro Watanabe's face became a little panicked. He wanted to get up and dodge David's fatal blow, but unfortunately the injury on his body was too severe, and Ichiro Watanabe could not stand with one blow. Kill him, kill him, kill him. In the stands, many people returned there, and even the representative teams of other countries shouted that David killed that Watanabe Ichiro. After all, this guy has made countless enemies, and if he loses to him, he will either die or be injured. This guy rarely spares others. But now it was his turn. Ichiro Watanabe's face was pale and his eyes were full of fear. No one is not afraid of death, especially people like Ichiro Watanabe, who are sought after by thousands of people, and they are even more afraid of death. I surrender. Just when David was about to finish off Ichiro Watanabe with one punch, Ichiro Watanabe suddenly made an unexpected move. I saw Watanabe Ichiro throw away the sword in his hand, and then knelt on the ground with a pious posture, admitting defeat without hesitation. Because he knows that the rule of the competition is that if the opponent admits defeat, then the opponent cannot attack. That's why Ichiro Watanabe kills and hurts people in the ring match. Chapter 920. This approach of Ichiro Watanabe instantly surprised everyone. Even David never thought that in the face of life and death, Ichiro Watanabe was so spineless. How can I say that this Watanabe Ichiro is also a swordsman and a master of Wuzong, and now he kneels directly, and he is still in front of thousands of people. If it were an ordinary person, it would definitely not be possible, but this Watanabe Ichiro did it. At this moment, he was kneeling on the ground, shouting loudly, I admit defeat, I admit defeat. Ha ha ha, I'm so fucking happy, Ichiro Watanabe's grandson also has today. Brilliant, this David is awesome, in his early 20s, he actually defeated Ichiro Watanabe. Instructor Chen is mighty, Instructor Chen is mighty. Whether it was those in the stands or the members of the Dharma Protector Pavilion, they all shouted excitedly. Only the representatives of the island countries have green faces, and they look as ugly as eating sh.t. This David is really interesting. Anna's look at David began to change. That Andrew looked at David with admiration and respect in his eyes, no contempt or disdain. What they most admired by the people of Xiong country is the strong, and the strength shown by David now makes Andrew admired. At this time, in the arena that had long since become ruins, David looked at Ichiro Watanabe, who was kneeling and admitting defeat, and could only withdraw his fist helplessly. Pooh! David spat fiercely at Watanabe Ichiro, and then slowly walked towards his team. Mr. Chen! Zhao Waoqi excitedly hurried up to meet him. David put one hand on Zhao Waoqi's shoulder, and suddenly the weight of his entire body fell on Zhao Waoqi's shoulder. Zhao Waoqi understood in an instant, and immediately supported David with his hand, gently dragging David, and walked towards the team. Although David defeated Ichiro Watanabe, at this moment David is already at the end of his force and has been holding on. After returning to the team, David was surrounded by the members of the Guardian Pavilion, and they all wanted to throw David up. "Congratulations!" Anna looked at David and took the initiative to reach out and said, "Thank you." David shook hands with Anna. "Chen, I'm sorry, I shouldn't look down on you." Andrew walked up to David and took the initiative to apologize. David just smiled lightly, and did not blame Andrew for his contempt at the beginning. The Guardian Pavilion cheered and cheered, while the island country was dead. Ichiro Watanabe stood up, wiped the spit from his face, and walked back slowly. Ichiro Watanabe's eyes flashed with murderous intent. Although he conceded defeat on his knees, it was only an expedient measure. He would not concede defeat easily. There are no rules to tell, he wants revenge on the island. The game was over, and David's name was also known to more people on this day, especially some warriors. Many people began to look at David differently because David defeated Ichiro Watanabe. However, there are also many people who have become uncomfortable with sleeping and eating after knowing this result. Xian Yuanyan was one of them. He didn't expect that in just a few days, David's strength had increased a lot, and even Ichiro Watanabe was defeated. It seems that they want revenge and their plan to take Longjing from David has to be rearranged. I also feel a little tricky. There are other families and sects who are going to take Longjing. They all spy on Longjing in David's body, but now that David's strength is exposed, these people have to re-examine David. They all think that David is the strength of a great master, and it seems that he has always been deceived. If they only regard David as the strength of a great master to deal with, they will suffer a big loss.